everybody. I hope you have had an excellent day, Wednesday. Been a long day. Yes, Kitty, we're going to read. Yes. Say hello. Say hello. You say hello? Well, anyway, I thought I'd read to you starting at chapter 6 of the Relic quest. The true story of one man's pursuit of the lost Ark of the Covenant. A real-life adventure, says Stone Phillips of Dateline NBC. Alrighty. On the Road Again, Chapter 6. After several months, Larry called. Not given to pleasantries, he got right to the point. I am thinking of going to Saudi Arabia very soon to check out the Mount Sinai site. Are you interested in going with me? The question caught me off guard. Am I interested? Of course I'm interested. My mind raced to keep up with my heart as I considered the possibilities. A few seconds later, Larry said, I'll pay for everything. Not much to think about there. Count me in. Good, I'll be in touch. He hung up. This short conversation would lead to difficult days and a lifetime of memories. I thought of the letter that Jim Irwin had given Larry in Egypt. It was not just a wrinkled piece of paper, but a map, a guide that pointed to a treasure more valuable than gold. That crumpled note might lead to a discovery that would rock the world of archaeology. It was the chance of a lifetime, and Larry and I both knew it. He had just made it possible for me to follow that dream halfway around the world. I reminded myself the two men had been arrested and jailed while exploring the mountain, and that their photographs had been confiscated. They left with no evidence. Could we succeed where they had failed? Perhaps the old adage would prove true. It's the second mouse that gets the cheese. Once Larry had made the decision to go, I knew it would happen. He was that kind of a guy. Everything might fall into place, or things could spoil apart. It could be easy or difficult, but that did not matter. Larry would make it happen. I ran the idea past Jim and learned he had already talked to Larry. Jim had tried pulling some strings, using his astronaut status to get us into Saudi Arabia, but he had hit a wall. Jim was unaccustomed to hearing no. You can't come. You're not invited. Out of the 6 billion people on planet Earth, he was one of a dozen who had traveled to the moon. He had been given a ticker-tape parade in New York City. Kings had adjusted their schedules in order to meet him, but apparently no one wanted him in the center of the Saudi kingdom. I could hear the frustration in his voice as he realized that his fame might hinder our chances. He had resigned himself to the fact that he was not going, and disappointment seeped through his words as he said, Go, find that mountain. My next conversation with Larry began with a pointed question. How are we going to get into the most closed country in the world? The only Americans getting into the country are employed by international oil companies or assigned as military personnel. Larry said, "Don't worry, we'll get in." This ambiguous answer meant that he did not have a clue how we would do it, but that somehow we would. In the days ahead, he would spend a pile of money traveling and making countless telephone calls to find a way into Saudi Arabia. Like Jim, he met with failure. There is absolutely no way to get a visa into Saudi, he was told. London. A glimmer of hope surfaced when a friend of Larry's in London said he could get us a visa. Jack Tremonti, a smooth-talking commodities broker, boasted of knowing a Saudi prince who happened to be in London. He assured us that he could get us a sponsorship into Saudi. That fell flat. The prince had flown to Scandinavia to see the northern lights, and we had no idea when he would return. Saudi Arabia again seemed out of reach. But Jack had not finished. He told Larry to come to London. He had another friend who knew people in high places in the Saudi embassy. This man could get us visas. It was good enough for Larry. He called to say, "It's a go." There was no hesitation in his voice, no wavering. He cleared our calendars and went to London. We did. Jack, a dapper man with a look of sophistication, met us at the airport. He introduced us to his friend Dimitri, a flamboyant Greek who chain-smoked and spoke in rapid, broken English. He was heavy-set, the buttons of his shirt strained to remain in place while threatening to give away at any moment. He struck me as a little shifty, and this image was enhanced by his constant use of the phrase, "I assure you there will be no problem." Every time he smiled, I got nervous. With rock-solid conviction, Dimitri promised that we would have our visas the next day. The next day came, and Dimitri met us with surprising news: no visas. The announcement did not sit well with Larry, and his displeasure brought a wave of defensiveness from Dimitri. In an effort to save face, he rushed us across town to his office. Rain poured down, making the day as gloomy as our spirits. Dimitri had an idea. In his files, he found an old letter faxed to him from the Saudi prince about an oil deal gone sour. The letter was on royal letterhead and bore the prince's official signature. The logo of the kingdom was at the top. Dimitri programmed his fax machine to match the identification number at the top of the prince's letter, and then set it to display the correct time in Saudi Arabia. He did a test fax to a friend. When the friend called to say that the test fax looked like it had come from the royal palace in Saudi Arabia, Dimitri beamed with pride. "This isn't what I bargained for," I told Larry. I could see what was happening, and I did not like it. The trip was taking a bad turn. In a matter of days, we had gone from entering the country legally to concocting some wild scheme with a forged royal signature. I'd gone from thinking this was a sure bet to knowing that we were taking our lives in our hands. Dimitri seemed determined to drag us into some grossly illegal intrigue that could get us imprisoned and possibly killed. My stomach soured as I watched Dmitri make a copy of the letterhead and signature and affix it to the fabricated sponsorship letter. It looked as if the prince had written it, but the signature came off the copier blotchy and blurred. It looked like the fake that it was, and no one knew how to fix it. I looked at Larry. I'm very uncomfortable with this. We could get in tremendous trouble. The room went silent except for the splat of raindrops pelting a large window. Are you bailing on me, Bob? I've spent a lot of money on this. If you can think of another way, say so now. But I need to know, are you in? There was no other way to get into Saudi Arabia, and I knew it. With those words in my ear, I crossed over. Thousands of miles from home, neck deep in international intrigue, I felt my manhood was in question, and I bent to the pressure of the moment. Yes, I'm in. Christians are persecuted in Saudi Arabia, and more terrorists, including the 9/11 hijackers, have come out of that country than any other. Some might say that this gave me ample justification to maneuver around their laws. Others would say, and with good reason, that it was wrong of me to go into Saudi so covertly. At the time, it seemed to be the only choice, a sliver of opportunity dangling in front of us. And we went for it. As the gray clouds turned to black, ushering in a dark London evening, I made a fatal choice that I would later regret. I turned to Dmitri, who sensed my disgust with the whole matter, and demanded the letter with the prince's signature. If we're going to do this, do it so we don't get caught, I said. I took the prince's signature and enlarged it on the copier to several times its normal size. I then took a pen and carefully retraced it, coloring in the gaps and imperfections. Then I returned to the copier and reduced the text to normal size. It looked perfect, bold, and official. We recopied the letter, transposed it over the prince's signature and letterhead, and faxed it to the Saudi embassy with the pre-programmed Saudi time and country code. It worked. The embassy faxed us back at a number we had put in the letter, telling us to come down with our papers and passports. With a little more finagling at the Saudi embassy, we were able to make a flight the next day. Once the door was closed on that Saudi airliner, I knew that there was no turning back. We were exchanging green fields and moderate temperatures for choking dust storms and unimaginable heat. We hoped to find a remote stone sentinel called Jebel al-Lance, known as to the local Bedouins as Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. The adrenaline that had propelled me this far was now waning. The gravity of what we were doing began to settle in my soul. I had an uneasy feeling about the ruse we had used to gain our visas, but I had come too far to back away now. As Henry Ward Beecher once said, in things pertaining to enthusiasm, no man is sane who does not know how to be insane or on proper occasions. I wondered if this might be a proper occasion for insanity. Jeddah. Saudi men and women filled the plane. Most of the men smoked cigarettes, and a noxious blue haze hovered in the cabin. A scratchy recorded prayer to Allah droned over the intercom. People started cramming into the bathrooms to ritually bathe for afternoon prayer. The flight attendants announced the direction of Mecca, and people filled the aisles to kneel and bow toward the heart of Islam, murmuring their prayers. A Saudi man sitting next to me noticed my keen interest in the cultural and religious activity around me. He smiled and asked in perfect English with only a wisp of Arabic accent, "Why are you going to Saudi Arabia? Are you working for the military, an oil company, perchance?" I stuttered a yes and left it at that. He smiled and asked nothing further of me, but chattered on about himself. He said he was an inventor, an electrical engineer, and went into detail about how Saudis punish criminal offenders by cutting off their hands and sometimes even their heads for transgressions against the law of the kingdom. He explained that he had invented a new way of amputating hands. He described a laser device that would separate a man's hand from his arm and cauterize the wound at the same time. When they used my device, there is very little blood spilled. He seemed very proud. I thought of the forged letter we were carrying and wondered if I was doomed to be this man's first client. I had enough of that conversation. Feigning a smile and fluffing my pillow, I turned toward the window and gazed into the high-altitude darkness. We deplaned at the Jeddah International Airport in Saudi Arabia. The night desert air was stifling, unable to slough off the heat of the day. As I left the plane, the heat enveloped me. What is it like in the broiling daytime sun, I wondered. The outside temperature was the least of our problems. Another fire burned inside of me. Ahead of us was a Saudi customs official. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had unknowingly issued valid travel visas to us 2 days earlier, based on a letter concocted in a London office. The ramifications of our deceit sent spurts of adrenaline through my body. I could taste it on my tongue. I got in line behind Larry. An expressionless young man occupied the cubicle before us. When it was Larry's turn, he walked nonchalantly to the customs official and slid his U.S. passport, stamped with the bogus entry visa, across the counter and through a narrow gap below a sheet of protective glass. The young Arab snapped it up. He tapped a few keys on his computer and peered at Larry. He hit a few more keys and gave him another long, scrutinizing gaze. My heart skipped, and a bead of sweat wound down my cheek. The customs official slid Larry's passport back across the counter and nodded with a dispassionate expression. Larry was in. I soon followed without any trouble. We both exhaled with relief and wove our way through the crowded terminal to our connecting flight to the city of Tabuk. Jebel Alons was almost within our grasp. Tabuk. The yammer of male conversation rattled down the interior of the plane. It sounded to me as if everyone were embroiled in heated arguments, but it was customary, sociable Arabic communication. We had left Jeddah in an aircraft packed with travelers, and the hubbub of conversation made the cabin seem even smaller. The men wore pressed white robes with headdresses and a traditional black agale. This standard article of Saudi attire reminded me of a car's fan belt. Centuries ago, Bedouin camel herders used similar headbands made of the rope to hobble the lead camel. When it was not around a camel's legs, the Bedouins used the agale to secure their scarves. The tradition had lasted for generations. I tried to doze, but found it impossible. I was still too amped. My heart had not settled down from the excitement of clearing customs a few hours earlier. Uneasiness clung to me like sweat. I still waited to feel a tap on my shoulder and hear, "You are under arrest. Come with us." Larry sat next to me, a compass held flat in his palm. He had been staring at the small, wobbly needle for 20 minutes. I leaned over and watched the compass slowly rotate to the right. Larry frowned as the dial made a second revolution. "We're flying in circles," he whispered. I looked out the window and saw nothing but the black velvet desert below. A few minutes later, a distant cluster of lights came into view. It was our destination, Tabuk. The lights passed slowly by the plane's window, once for each revolution of the teetering compass needle. We were well over an hour late for landing, and that did not bode well. Larry tapped the face of the compass. Something must be wrong. We continued circling, the other passengers seemingly oblivious of the situation. I had been unsettled to begin with, and this was not helping. There was an awful sound of twisted metal as the airplane jerked, then pitched as if seized by a giant hand. The engine roared as the pilots increased the power. There was a surge forward, then the power dropped and the plane began to plunge. Overhead bins popped open, disgorging bags of fruit, carry-on sacks, and luggage. A cascade of personal belongings fell into the aisle and onto stunned passengers. Someone screamed. The aircraft would free fall, then recover a few moments later. It would heave to the left and back to the right, snapping us around like a roller coaster ride. Our one engine would roar, then another. I guessed that the pilot had lost some control of the flaps. If I was right, we were in a lot of trouble. Panic spread, and I looked at Larry. He shrugged and gave an unconvincing smile. This does not look good. He would get no argument from me. I looked out the window and was surprised and disturbed to see the buildings. We were much closer to the ground than I had realized. Just below and coming fast were the runway and the beacon lights. An eternity of seconds later, the landing gear slammed onto the tarmac. The plane bounced and shuddered, its engines moaning painfully as the pilot reversed thrust. The front tires exploded on impact. A hideous screeching pierced the air as the big jet's bare wheel hubs gorged a groove in the runway. Sparks flew past my window. The impact compressed my spine and drove the air from my lungs. I waited for the inevitable, whatever that might be. Finally, the plane shuddered and lurched to a stop at the end of the runway. My heart began to beat again. Chaos filled the cabin. People were desperate to get off a plane that could burn at any moment. They crowded the aisles and pressed against the exit door. Larry and I waited for the stampede to subside. There was nothing else we could do. There was more chaos outside. Fire trucks arrived, splashing the runway and the airplane with crimson light. Firemen and fire protective proximity suits unfurled hoses and bathed the plane with white foam. "Welcome to Tabuk," I said. We deplaned safely. In the terminal, we overheard talk of a hydraulic problem. We were fortunate in the outcome. On the ground. At 3 a.m., we climbed into a cab and gave our destination as the Tabuk Sahara Hotel. At that hour, I expected the small town to be asleep, its streets empty. Instead, couples strolled along the sidewalks. Playgrounds were busy with children, and families were picnicking on the sandy highway up median. I had to ask, "What is everyone doing out at this time of night?" The driver explained, "It's too hot in the daytime for the children to be out in the sun. They sleep all day and come out only at night." I felt the knock in my stomach again. Larry and I planned to spend a week in a desert that was too hot for the locals. After we checked into our hotel rooms, I collapsed into bed and did not wake up until mid-morning on Friday, a weekend day for the Saudis. Our first order of business was to rent a truck and get enough provisions and supplies to sustain us in no man's land for at least a week. A cab took us into a business district of Tabuk, a drab, antiseptic town of gray and white cement buildings. We stopped at a truck rental company. In front of the building, a camel knelt in the cargo bed of a small pickup, another reminder that I was not in Colorado. Larry spent 20 minutes signing papers, and soon we had a small white Datsun pickup truck. When we went for supplies, the shop owners had closed their doors. Muslim culture requires compliance with prayer time. Although most followers are sincere in their faith, there is also a social pressure for shop owners to conform. Their patrons would view their absence unfavorably, and that might affect business. We would just have to wait. Once prayers were over, worshipers filled the streets and commerce resumed. We foraged from shop to shop to supply our trek into the Saudi frontier. The back of our pickup was soon filled with canned meat, fruit, cases of bottled water, shovels, rope, flashlights, batteries, and several 20-gallon jerrycans for gasoline reserves. We bought some Arab outfits of robes, scarves, and a gale, foolishly thinking that we would then fit in among the desert Bedouins. Larry thought that instant suntan lotion might allow us to blend in better. Unfortunately, the cream made our skin orange. Our shopping complete, we retired to the hotel to cool off in the pool. There we quizzed each other on everything that could go wrong. We came up with countless scenarios and what-ifs. However many times we rehearsed our plan, I could not stop imagining 2 sets of bleached bones perched on a sand dune in the middle of nowhere. Larry clutching an empty canteen in his bony fingers, and me holding a hand-scrawled note that said, obviously, we did not think of everything. The evening wind unleashed a sandstorm. It hurtled powerfully across the flat desert, sucking up grains of sand. There was nothing to blunt its advance. Outside the hotel, sand pinched off our window as the howling wind rattled the panes of glass. It was a great night to be indoors. On the road, sleet was sporadic, but the winds finally subsided. Larry awoke with enthusiasm, eager to get to the mountain. We checked out of the hotel by 6 a.m. and headed into the pre-dawn dark. The sun's orange disk soon spilled over the desert horizon, casting long shadows from dramatically furrowed rock formations. We were crossing the ancient land of Midian, where the Bible says Moses met God at the burning bush on the slopes of Mount Sinai. 40 years before the burning bush experience, Moses had killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but he escaped from Egypt and went to live in Midian, east of the Gulf of Aqaba in what is now Saudi Arabia. We followed the snaking highway for 2 hours before finding our first landmark, the remote Alcan gas station. Our wilderness turnoff was supposed to be 4 miles beyond that point, but there was no exit, no turnoff, and nothing that even resembled a road. David Fassel's map showed a road at Alcan, but all we saw in front of us was a wisp of trail stretching into the dunes and jagged mountains, barely discernible among the scattered rocks of the desert floor. Within minutes, we were negotiating the floor of an immense desert valley that split into scores of narrow forks and wadis. Each subdivided the desert into dense clusters of winding ravines and stone-filled ditches. Every 50 yards or so, we encountered huge rocks. Sand drifts and sagebrush blocked our path. Maps were useless, and soon we knew that we were following the wrong path. We bounced and crunched through bruising ruts and scrub-filled ravines, bottoming out every few yards and fearing that at any moment we'd crack the oil pan and end the expedition. The heat grew unbearable. Our small thermometer read 117 degrees, and it was only late morning. The thermometer would climb to 128 degrees in less than 2 hours, and our truck had no air conditioning. Even if it did, the extreme temperature and the toiling exertion would overheat the engine. The cab became a sweat box. We rolled up our windows because the heat blowing off the desert sand was unbearable. It was like looking down the barrel of a hair dryer. Larry and I sucked down prodigious amounts of water and occasionally poured the warm liquid over our heads. This soaking helped for only a few minutes. Dust seeped through the air vents, caking our sweaty skin with a gray, gritty film. We were not alone. We passed small Bedouin encampments where pickup trucks hauling sheep, cases of supplies, and large tanks of water were engaged in the difficult work of desert commerce. We lumbered deep into sheep country, frequently passing what looked like huge beach umbrellas raised several feet off the ground. and tethered by ropes to tall poles. Tightly bunched herds of sheep huddled under these shelters, escaping the sun's ravaging rays in the tiny patches of shade. We were lost. The desert that had been a few safe landmarks on a small map had become an immense foe that could easily consume us if we ventured farther into its sandy expanse. Hoping to find our way back to the asphalt highway, I tried to turn the truck around. As I made the U-turn, the wheels of the truck left the two grooves of hard-packed sand and sank in the soft shoulder. Gunning the engine set the wheels spinning, spewing hot sand like a geyser. The truck sank to its axles. Without a word, Larry swung his door open to see how badly we were stuck. I joined him in surveying the situation. We were trapped. The image of bleached bones seemed suddenly more vivid and real. In desperation, I grabbed the rear bumper, planted my boots on the ground, and told Larry to gun the engine. I lifted and pushed, giving it all I had. Suddenly, something snapped in my lower back. Surging pain shot up my spine. For the next few minutes, I was unable to breathe. I clenched my teeth, stifled a scream, and dropped to my knees as if I had been shot. Larry killed the engine and came around to the back. I assured him that I would be okay, but Larry isn't even fooled. He saw the agony on my face. Larry started to say something when, seemingly out of nowhere, a pickup truck pulled near. Neither of us had seen or heard it coming. It was a sun-faded olive-green Jeep with a makeshift bed bolted on the back, crammed full of gawking kids. The driver, a robed man wearing a red-checkered cafetiere, stared at us for a moment in disbelief. His expression said, "What in the world are two white guys doing out here?" The robes and instant tanning cream had not fooled him. He approached cautiously. I imagine we made an unusual sight. Larry helped me to my feet as the Bedouin took in my pain and our immovable truck. He looked at me and then looked at the truck again. With a wave, he called the older boys from the truck, and they scampered over. Bedouins have a desert code. They always help one another. If a stranger comes to a Bedouin's tent, the Bedouin is duty-bound by centuries of Arab custom to take the sojourner in as a guest. Larry smiled and bowed, gesturing to a big bag of oranges in the back of our truck. Man nodded, and soon every child had an orange. They were a big hit. The kids crawled out of the back of the Jeep and began shedding the rinds, biting into the orange like they were apples. They giggled as juice dripped from their chins and exchanged comments among themselves about the odd men who were stuck in the sand. The Bedouin and the other boys walked to the truck. Older boys walked to the truck and rocked it from side to side. A small stream of sand trickled under the two left tires as the truck rocked right. When it rocked left, the right tires rose and sand filtered under them. After a few bouncing sideways shoves, the truck rose up from the grasp of the desert. The father got in the truck, started it, and feathered the clutch while his sons pushed the vehicle free and onto the hard-packed road. Larry thanked the man and boys profusely, bowing and shaking their hands. Can you take us to J-Ball Alliance? Larry asked. The smiles and celebration vanished. The Bedouin's countenance darkened and his gracious manner evaporated. A look of fear swept across his face as he talked quietly with the boys. One produced a pencil and paper and jotted down the license number of our truck. Clearly something forbidden was associated with the mountain. I feared we might have crossed the line. Larry was not so easily put off. After long, intense negotiations, he somehow persuaded the man to show us where the mountain was located in a chaotic jumble of peaks that surrounded us. In his jeep, our rescuer led us down a gentle slope and up a hill, narrow ridge. 5 minutes later, we were parked at the foot of a wide, sloping wall of granite, and our reluctant guide stepped from his truck. Crouching like an Indian scout in an old Western movie, he began crawling up the rock face. We followed, staying low as he maneuvered to a rocky crest overlooking a low, yawning plain. There, kneeling beneath the silhouette of a huge boulder, the Bedouin pointed towards something in the distance. J-Ball Alliance, he whispered, as if unfriendly ears were nearby. We peered over the valley. There it was, the mountain we had traveled so far to see. Rising majestically from the desert floor, it displayed two sharp, distinctively blackened summits. We were finally looking at the real Mount Sinai. Chapter 7. J-Ball Alliance. The Bedouin was agitated. He moved closer to me and pointed again toward the mountain. J-Ball Alliance. J-Ball Alliance, I repeated, nodding. Certain that we understood, he moved back down the rocky slope. The man who had come to our aid, who appeared confident and capable of handling our situation, now looked mortified and hollow. He negotiated the steep incline easily, but seemed to be having trouble with the revelation he had given. I felt a measure of guilt. Had we presumed too much on the Bedouin culture so deeply rooted in the man? Had our cocky Western ways placed him on the horns of a social dilemma? Perhaps, but what was done was done. He had honored us twice, first by coming to our aid, and now by disclosing the very thing we had risked so much to find. Larry and I remained hunkered down behind the crest of the rocky knoll. That's it, Larry whispered. J-Ball Alliance. His tone captured my mood. I felt awe and surprise, joy and relief. My heart pounded and my mind raced. The mountain was more than special, it was imperial. It wasn't its height. I had climbed peaks that dwarfed it. It wasn't its beauty, for it lacked the kind of splendor that would move a painter's soul. Nonetheless, it was more majestic than anything I had ever seen. Its grandeur was larger than life. Larry stood abruptly, yanking me from my trance. What is that? He pointed. I looked where he directed and saw a fence. In this land of open spaces stood a 15-foot high fence topped with barbed wire. It appeared to stretch around the base of the mountain. It was a modern chain-link barricade set with galvanized poles. As a police officer, I had seen prison fences, and this wasn't much different. The last thing I expected to see in the middle of nowhere was a fence around a mountain. Why would anyone put a fence around a barren? The sound of a truck engine coming to life interrupted me. I turned to see our new friend pull away, leaving us in a cloud of dust. As I watched, he speedily rounded a bend without looking back. We had worn out our welcome. I guess Bedouins don't believe in long goodbyes, Larry grumbled. Our reluctant guide had abandoned us without a word. The abruptness of his departure concerned me. Had he gone off to inform the authorities? If so, we would soon know. We returned to our Datsun, started the engine, and moved down the incline of the road as quietly as possible. We found a large open basin, not wanting to be too obvious. We parked in a small clearing behind a hill, out of sight of travelers who might use the valley trail. It is difficult for a man to be calm and professional when he has stumbled upon the treasure he has been seeking, but Larry and I tried. We moved from the truck to the fence across open ground and found a large sign. The white letters on a blue background were written in English and Arabic and said, "No trespassing allowed." It was as if they had been expecting us. The bottom of the sign was notarized by the Saudi Minister of Antiquities, confirming that this was a restricted archaeological site. Seeing the fence and the sign made me think of David Fassel's letter. We knew that he had been to the site and that the fence had been erected following Fassel's misadventure. The seizure of his notes and film had alerted the kingdom to the site's archaeological significance and likely Jewish origins, and they had simply fenced it off to keep people like Larry and me out. Months of planning, dreaming, hoping, and tens of thousands of dollars had led us to this mountain. Now a chain-link fence held us at bay. I studied the fence for a while. About a quarter-mile to the north was a small concrete building, a guardhouse. Maybe. I was not going to go ask. Had we really come halfway around the world only to be stopped by a fence? If this was really Mount Sinai, we expected a trove of hewn altars, pillars, ruins, and odd geologic anomalies, all of which needed documentation. We had to get inside the fence. The altar of the calf. We spent the next hour poking along the perimeter of the fence. Before we left the States, David Fassel had told Larry to look for a series of petroglyphs, ancient rock etchings of bulls or cows, on a pile of boulders. The boulders, he had said, appeared to be a construction, not a random accumulation of stones. And they were supposed to be in the valley we were exploring. Fasshold thought that it was a religious site, perhaps the altar on which Aaron had placed the gold statue of the calf he had made. Fassel's sketchy directions said from base of mountain, altar located east of second set of rutted tire tracks as they go up valley. This was no help at all. The rocks all looked the same, and too many tire tracks crisscrossed the terrain. Larry and I decided to split up in order to cover more ground. My back had not let me forget what I had done to it. Spasms rolled through my lumbar region like storm-driven ocean waves, and at times I had to stop to catch my breath. I focused on the ground, concentrating on every step and hoping to loosen the wad of muscle constricting the base of my spine. I hobbled over another rise and down a shallow swale. I had hiked to the shadowed side of the mountain and was thankful to be out of the sun. As I looked along the mountain's base and up the slope, my eyes fell on a huge pile of stacked granite. I blinked a few times to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Large boulders sat one upon another as though a giant hand had placed them there. It was an altar. More than that, I felt certain that I was looking at the most infamous altar in history. I could not imagine any set of natural circumstances that would account for that loose yet calculated arrangement. This man-made formation sat high on the otherwise pancake-flat plain, a totem to bygone events, a fence similar to that which surrounded Jabal Alon's encompassed it. So close and yet so far. I wanted to speak, but no words came. Another sign posted in Arabic and English warned trespassers to stay out. In my imagination, a new line formed at the bottom of the sign. This means you, Bob. Considering our situation, I should have walked to a place where I could quietly get Larry's attention and wave him over. Instead, I cried out, "Larry, Larry, over here." And the time it took for Larry to appear, I inspected the size and configuration of the rocks. From every angle it remained an altar, clearly the result of human design. Thick and imposing as the bottom and flat on top. The boulders were so large and unwieldy that hefting them into place would have required hundreds of able-bodied workers. I knew what could happen to a man just trying to free a truck stuck in the mud. These stones were placed by an orchestrated effort. I took the Bible from my backpack and opened it, fanning the pages until I found a verse that was flashing neon bright in my brain. Exodus 1:11. The Old Testament book of Exodus tells how the Hebrew slaves were forced by their Egyptian masters to do bitter, back-breaking labor. The Hebrew slaves built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh, NIV. A people who could build cities could make a large stone altar like this one. Larry came hopping over the rise. His khaki shirt and pants were shining with sweat. "Hush," he scolded as he approached. "Keep it down. Look." I pointed to the altar. "I saw Bedouin guards and dogs behind the fence," Larry said in a sharp, low tone. "The guards had rifles. We've got to be careful. You can't just... His voice trailed off as his jaw dropped. I waited as he stood gawking, neck craned, taking in the sight. His face lit up. We circled the stack of boulders, snapping photographs, noting its unique features, and stopping here and there to peer through the fence. The sharp contrast of the altar's thin shadows against the blinding sun made the petroglyphs hard to see, but they were there, ancient-looking engravings in the flat rock face. There was one of a bull, another of a calf. The most striking one was of a man holding a calf over his head, its spiraling horns replicating those of the ancient Egyptian Apis and Hathor bull gods. But why cattle? Why here? This wasn't cattle country, it was sheep country, and had been so for as long as men had walked these plains. Our search had just begun, but the presence of these engraved Egyptian cow deities on what must certainly be an altar was well beyond coincidence. It was important to be objective, but I could not help thinking I was looking at the altar mentioned in Exodus. This was the place where the golden calf had offended God. Larry went to get his metal detector. He wanted to see if any gold particles or residue had survived. The Bible states that Aaron melted the gold jewelry the Israelites had taken from Egypt to make the calf idol, and later gold would be used in making the Ark of the Covenant. The gold had been given to the former slaves by Egyptians who, after 10 horrible plagues, were glad to be rid of them. Because the Israelites had made the calf in haste, Larry thought that some gold might inadvertently been lost. A hurried forging process might have been a sloppy one. The only way to know was to check. Larry removed a suitcase-sized state-of-the-art metal detector from the back of the truck. He had spent thousands of dollars on it, but he could not get it to work. It worked just fine when I tested it at home. His frustration was growing. Finally, he removed the cover plate over the battery. His expression said it all. I forgot to bring the battery. A $6 battery. The loneliness of Midian. We decided to camp for the night, and then, if my back allowed, make our ascent up the back of the mountain away from the guardhouse. I tried walking, taking easy steps and hoping to limber up my back, but it cramped tighter. It was humiliating. My whole life I'd dealt with pain. I had played football in college and had learned how to put my dislocated shoulder back in joint to keep playing. As a policeman, I'd been banged around and beat up, but I just kept going. Now, standing where in all likelihood Moses once walked, I wondered if I would be able to get to my feet in the morning. Our campsite was nestled into an S-shaped ravine, a perfect spot with plenty of shade and cover. No one could see us from the road. We had a clear view of the back of the mountain, which helped to familiarize us with the terrain. Dinner was dried fruit and granola bars, since a fire was out of the question. In the desert, any light is visible for miles. After a while, I limped off to a tilting rock to sit and collect my thoughts. I knew that the next day would hold the key to our success or failure. The sun sank at its leisure. As it dipped toward the horizon, a slight breeze from the Red Sea slipped over the mountains. The stir of air cooled my sweat-soaked shirt, a welcome respite from the day of relentless heat. Without ice or air conditioning, the water in our plastic bottles was always warm, like sipping water from a hot tub. The dying sun offered only a little hope that we could survive this inferno, and with my back still knotted in pain, I wondered if I would ever get to climb the mountain I had traveled so far to see. The sun slipped behind the western hills, and the desert became still, except for the whisper of wind. I glanced at my watch. It seemed that I'd been sitting motionless for hours, but the dial said that only 10 minutes had passed. In the desert, time slows to a crawl. Opened my Bible to the passage in Exodus that speaks of Moses' tending Jethro's flocks for 40 years before God redirects him. Moses led, fed, protected flocks of dumb, bleating sheep. He was 80 years old when God called him to the far side of the desert and gave him his marching orders. I could not imagine anyone lasting 4 decades in this vast wilderness. I was having trouble lasting a single day, and my 40th birthday was a good way off. In the distance, through fading twilight, I could see a shepherd tending a tiny flicker of a campfire. He was settling his flock for the night. That's when I realized that God had used this land to prepare Moses. He did not use a prestigious university or a military academy. Instead, he used a demanding desert to forge the kind of character necessary for Moses to do the job. 40 years of lonely, patient survival in the sand, sagebrush, and scorching sun. The unsettling sense had been building in me that my being in this desert at this time, with pain searing my back, was forging something in me. I wasn't prepared for this moment, and I knew it. Unlike Moses, I wasn't equipped to stand on sacred soil. Encountering God was heady, soul-shaking work. For some time I had considered myself a believer in God. I wasn't a Bible thumper, but I had a growing understanding that the words in the Bible were true and verifiable if someone would just take the accounts at face value and go looking. Jim Irwin had started me down that path. The Bible had been his guide, and now it was becoming mine. I had heard Jim speak of his epiphany, of how he had stood in the gray soil of the moon and gazed across 250,000 miles of black space to see the blue and white globe that was the home of humanity. Wrapped in the protective cocoon of his spacesuit, he was as alone as a man could be, and yet he was not alone. Jim Irwin said he encountered God on that desolate spot of the moon. Now I was looking up from a desolate spot on earth to Jim Irwin's moon, which for a few moments had been his place of revelation. I knew that what Larry and I had found here in the desert would stay with me wherever my travels led me. What would the coming hours bring? I had no idea. Would I be ready to climb that mountain as morning spread over the sun-bleached sand? Or was my journey over after all our intense preparation, effort, and intrigue? Had it boiled down to these few terrible hours of groping uncertainty, of hoping that I too might find my destiny on the far side of the sandy wilderness? Dawn. Dawn breaks fast in the desert just before the sun's rays stretch across the desert floor. The heat slaps you with an open hand. There is no soft transition from the pre-dawn chill, but an instant prickly discomfort that really portends another day of relentless heat. On our first morning at the foot of Jebel Allah, as the sun began its journey from behind the jagged outline of the eastern mountains. It was a moment of reckoning. I had spent the night in restless, uncomfortable sleep, my back refusing to forgive me for my previous bad decision. I had a phobia about snakes, so I had slept in the pickup, squeezing my bulky frame onto its narrow bench seat. I stretched my legs out one door and rested my feet on 3 boxes of water stacked beside the truck. My intermittent sleep became impossible when headlights from a rattling truck glared into our camp sometime after midnight. I heard some quick Arabic chatter, and then the truck backed off, leaving my senses even more racketed up. Every noise from the desert seemed threatening, even the sound of Larry's high-tech silver foil mylar space blanket crinkling and crackling at the slightest breeze was ominous. I stood and tested my back with short, tentative steps. Despite the poor sleeping conditions, it had loosened somewhat, but it still throbbed painfully. I was far from healed, but at last I could stand, walk, and bend. I was going to climb Jebel Allah. It would not be easy, but the pain of staying would be worse than the pain of going. After a quick breakfast of dehydrated fruit and bread, we filled our packs with water bottles, cameras, film, and protein bars. I found a 6-foot cane pole left from a disbanded Bedouin camp and used it as a hiking staff. We shuffled across a thin stretch of exposed valley to the base of the mountain. Unlike the east side of the peak, the mountain's backside was not fenced. We planned to climb up the back and come down the barricaded front where most of our archaeological interest lay, along with the guards. We wore khaki clothing as camouflage against the sandy terrain and knew to keep a low profile. We figured that sooner or later the Bedouin patrols stationed nearby would spot us, but there was no reason to make it easy for them. Then trails fanned out before us like strands of a spider web. We chose a path up the hillside and set a brisk pace on a surprisingly tame gradient. Jebel al-Lawz isn't a big mountain, and Larry and I had both done a fair amount of technical climbing, so in spite of an occasional sharp back spasm, it was an easy ascent for me. I pictured Moses, 80 years old, when he ascended the peak for the first time, trudging stoically to the top without undue hardship. The most intimidating obstacles we faced were jagged rocks and stinging briars that made me glad we had worn leather gloves. However, the gloves were no help against the cactus needles. Tiny spots of blood peppered my socks, pants, and shirt. We backtracked once when we encountered impossible cliffs, then got quickly back on course, scrambling up an alluvial fan of loose gravel that ascended into a twisting ravine through fields of huge boulders and unstable scree. The trail dissolved near the top, so we clambered up the final pitch as best we could, forcing one foot in front of the other and sometimes going hand over hand, skirting rows of narrow ledges and stretching our bodies past sharp spires and fat outcroppings. There were some tricky moments. We shinned along a slick granite wall that angled over a sheer 40-foot drop. Our excitement overwhelmed caution and common sense. 2 hours into our climb, we reached the summit. Twin snub-nosed peaks were separated by a broad rock-strewn bowl that pitched downward like a huge open-air amphitheater. With each footstep, I wondered as if I was crossing the stage on which the most extraordinary drama in human history had unfolded. As we strained over the last flinty hogback, we saw the stunning panorama of the desert below. As the tallest peak in the area, Jebel al-Lawz offers a spectacular vista of yellow-tinted hills and taupe plains fixed in ageless wind and sand-sculpted shapes and textures. The morning sky was clear, and we could see for miles in all directions. To the west lay the faint slate-tinted coast of the Red Sea. To the north and south, majestic mountain ranges bounded by broad desert. Cresting a final step of crumbling sandstorms terrace, Larry asked, "Do you think we're the first Westerners to reach this summit since the time of Moses?" There was no way to know who had stood on the peak over the centuries, but it was a fair bet, and I was willing to believe it. We had crossed oceans and continents to stand on this peak, and it had seized our imaginations. We had agreed to touch the top at the same time, a silly all-for-one and one-for-all mountain climber thing. We were a team, and it was important for us to summit together. We counted in unison and planted our feet. It was a moment of celebration, reveling in the probability that we were standing on one of the most historic places on earth. We took several minutes to slap each other's back and congratulate ourselves, snap pictures, and just drink it in. 8,000 feet, we were standing near the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Was this not the unique place where God met with man in a lingering season, unprecedented intimacy, and fearsome wrath? Larry produced a piece of paper, and we both wrote a note to future travelers, extending our greetings and giving the time and date of our arrival. Then Larry placed a note in an empty plastic, because I was charging, water bottle, and buried it under some rocks. I thought it was excessive gesture, but for Larry it sealed the deal. It was a time capsule for posterity. I had my own business to attend to. I pulled from my pack a little tube containing a rolled up American flag. When I take it with me around the world, I got the idea from Jim Irwin. We brought flags back from the moon. He had brought flags back from the moon. I had Larry snap a picture of me holding it on the summit, hoping to pass it on to my kids. I opened my Bible and wrote an inscription commemorating the day with the scripture verse. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Exodus 19:20. The scorched black peak. And then I remembered in the bustle and excitement I had not focused on the main feature that had gripped us from a distance. The strange dark crown that shrouded the summit with a shadowy stain. Glancing about, I immediately saw that the entire summit where we stood was unusually black. The rocks and even the dirt had a shining tone like polished obsidian. The effect was startling, and we were genuinely baffled. We had hiked through acres of sagebrush and buff and beige sandy ridges to reach the top. That was all typical desert terrain, but now at the summit we stood on what appeared to be burned rock. What could have caused that? The sun was rising. The Bedouins below were probably awake and steeping their breakfast tea. The early morning was quickly slipping away, so we collected as many loose rocks as our packs would hold for future laboratory analysis. Larry seemed utterly mystified. This has got to be a volcanic peak. I could think only one way to find out if it's volcanic. I said that the rocks inside will be black too, right? Makes sense. Picked up a watermelon-sized piece of charred rock, lifted it over my head, and slammed it down hard on the sharp edge of a boulder. It cracked open. My back protested, but I needed to know. We leaned in to look. The slick black exterior encased a reddish-tan core of ordinary brown granite. Larry broke the silence. Well, I guess that answers that question. But it did not add up. What type of heat would melt the surface of a rock, the black marble, glazed and smooth to the touch like buffed opal, yet leave the underlying granite intact? Clearly something intensely hot had torched the mountaintop. But what heat source could be potent enough to create a black rock rind while leaving a natural tan marrow? Larry was handling the rock like fine china. There's something in the Bible about this. I took out my Bible and flipped through the pages. Here it is, I said, Exodus 19:16 through 19. I read aloud the account of how 3 days after the Exodus party arrived at Mount Sinai, the mountain was mysteriously clothed in a thick cloud, the skies above filled with thick clouds. Although most maps indicate that Jebel Alon's is volcanic, geographical analysis of the rocks we brought back concluded that they were not volcanic, but metamorphic. Metamorphic rocks are changed by recrystallization from extreme heat or pressure occurring after they are formed. So with thick clouds, thunder, and lightning. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. There was more, but those few words said it all. Seeing the rock and holding it, I could understand why the Israelites had been so frightened that they begged Moses to speak with God while they retreated to a safer place, safer distance. A holy, omnipotent God is an unbearable reality to unruly people, and it was unbearable to me. I thought of the forgery I had been part of, the deceit and self-seeking stubbornness, the bullying aside of restraint and protocol to enter Saudi Arabia and strong-arm my way to the sacred soil. I was here illegally at a place so holy that God had told the Israelites not to touch the dirt at the base of the mountain or they would die. Exodus 19:12. Shaken, I turned to Larry and urged, "Let's go now. We've got to get off this mountain." I grabbed to my pack. The cleft of the rock. Larry placed the lens cap back on his Nikon. I guess I've got all the pictures we need at the top, he said. I detected his hesitancy. He studied me as he had studied the rocks. "Are you all right?" "Yeah, I'll be fine." I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. "Let's just go." Shuffling our hands and knees across the slippery scree, we paused briefly at the bowl-shaped amphitheater below the pinnacle as we searched for a path down the mountain. Tucked between the snub-nosed peaks was a hidden plateau, easily 2 football fields long. It was strewn with boulders larger than houses. Just below the second peak, a triangular monolith had formed from 2 large rocks tilted against one another. They formed a V. In the crook or cleft of the V stood a lone almond tree, firm as a flagpole. I couldn't help but notice that this cleft was just wide and deep enough for a man to lie down inside. I recalled the words I had read in Exodus 33:21-22. The Lord said, "Here is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. So it shall be while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and will cover you with my hand while I pass by." The river. Halfway down the rocky face, we found a spacious table ledge concealed behind a tuft of cactus. It was the protective vantage point we needed to survey the front slope. We laid out our cameras, telephoto lenses, and binoculars and set to work, running down a checklist of man-made and natural features that should also be present if Jebel Alon's was the real Mount Sinai. First, we had to find traces of a river. Deuteronomy 9:21 speaks of a brook or river somewhere on Mount Sinai where Moses disposed of the crushed remains of the golden calf. Stay. He ground it to dust and threw it into the brook that descended from the mountain. Looking north across the grade, not 20 feet from our hidden perch, we saw a large ravine snaking down the mountain. It was an old riverbed. The meandering channel emanated from the mountain's west face, where it curled back and pitched steeply down the east-facing slope, emptying into the plain. An ancient watershed, now the chalky remnant of a bygone wellspring, were large water-smoothed boulders, clear evidence of water flow. I checked that off the list. The Cave of Elijah. From our shelter we turned to scan the upper peak. Had we missed something up there? The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the peak in its brilliant glare. Larry studied the upper heights with his binoculars while I reloaded the camera. There, he said, just below the second peak. Squinting into the sun, I saw a cave sheltered beneath the lip of the plateau that overlooked the valley floor. How did we miss that? I asked. The cave was obvious and no more than 50 yards from where we had stood, looking at the cliff. 1 Kings 19:8-9 speaks of a cave on Mount Sinai used by Elijah to hide from Jezebel. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God, and there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. It was a crucial landmark. We can have kicked ourselves for not exploring it when we had the chance. Who knows what markings or petroglyphs it contained? Fear that we might already have been spotted prevented us from climbing back up. We would have to leave it for now. Stone markers. We turned our attention again toward the front slope and scrutinized it for the next hour. We might never have this opportunity, and we did not want to miss anything else like we had missed the cave. A scintillating array of features began to emerge. On the surrounding plain, an orderly series of sun-bleached rock piles encircled the front of the peak. We had bumped into a couple of these the day before, but had thought they were Bedouin burial mounds. From this elevation, we could see that they were stone markers, arranged as tidy 400-yard intervals and forming a perfect semicircle about the mountain. My pulse raced as I rifled through Exodus to chapter 19, verse 12. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Those physical barriers were erected to spare humans and livestock the fatal fallout of God's fiery presence. Were these orderly stands of rock those sacred markers? An incredible collage was emerging as Mount Sinai revealed itself to us. 12 pillars of Israel. Check this out, Larry whispered in my ear. He pointed to the base of the mountain. Look down there. He kept his binoculars pressed to his eyes. You're not going to believe it. I looked. Nestled against the bluff near the mouth of the ravine was an angular stone altar. It was a V-shaped structure, clearly man-made. The tip of one arm pressed into the fold of the ridge, and its companion slanted away at a 45-degree angle. I estimated its length to be 120 feet. It was an altar of some sort, badly weathered and crumbling in spots, that stood 5 feet high and about 20 feet across. The remains of a central support wall ran the length of both arms of the V. Beside the altar, in an almost straight line, were what looked like the hewn stumps of stone pillars. Time and the elements had toppled them over, and they lay in broken sections, mostly near the altar. I was now flipping pages again, racking my memory and searching for references. Exodus 24:4-5 gave a thrilling explanation of what we were looking at. Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. This must be the altar, sitting precisely at the foot of the mountain, that Moses had built in preparation for Israelite worship. I counted the pillar stumps. There were 12 of them. That is the altar and pillars where the Israelites offered burnt offerings to God. Larry started snapping away with a telephoto lens. Incredible, he said between clicks of the shutter. This is amazing. I agreed. We had taken the Bible at face value with no agenda to prove. All we wanted was to find the real Mount Sinai. I did a quick mental inventory to make sure the pieces were fitting. Scorched and blackened peak, an ancient riverbed, a cave, a massive stone altar, 12 pillars, sacred markers, and a curious cleft in the rock. It was all there. We could add to our evidence the statement in Galatians 4:25 that said Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Jebel Alons is next to a desert with 9 direct points of connection between the ground upon which we stood and a place described in the Bible. I cannot forget the large stone altar with the petroglyphs that I had seen the day before. The number of confirmations continued to rise. No single item, the cave, the dry wash, could have demonstrated that this was Mount Sinai. But finding so many correlated pieces of evidence was beyond coincidence. Cecil B. DeMille had found the 10 Commandments here without moving a stone. I have spent several years of my adult life as an investigative detective. I understood the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt that was needed to secure a criminal conviction. I had been trained to connect tiny, seemingly unrelated bits of evidence to a winning verdict. One drop of blood or piece of thread can turn the decision in a criminal case. In my opinion, the cause for Jebel Alons would win in any courtroom. We had spotted just 1 or 2 unique anomalies. I might have had doubts. The scorched mountaintop, the man-made altars, the petroglyphs, the pillars, and the stone markers were stunning in and of themselves. But it was the sum of these things that testified to the site's authenticity. As I sat up and stared across the plain, an arresting scene began to unfold. I imagined the flickering glow of thousands of Israelite campfires warming the valley. I pictured Hebrew children playing beside their tents and livestock kneeling to drink beside a huge reservoir carved into the plain. The official name of the mountain is Jebel Alons, so I was now convinced that it was Mount Sinai, the site of one of the most amazing stories ever told. I'm going to stop there. Next chapter is a backward Exodus, chapter 8. Y'all have a good day, good evening, good night.